just told that I have to remain here. It's a pleasure to introduce to you Tom Pyle, who's, as I mentioned, the chairman of the very well-known Institute of Energy Research in Washington, D.C. He's also very involved in the politics of energy in the United States and beyond. And I'm sure you'd be very interested in what he has to say. We had discussed that he should perhaps say a few words about what's going to happen November 8th. But beyond that, what's really interesting is how the American shale revolution has affected the energy world. Which, by the way, you may or may not know that, Tom, but we here in this country have forbidden people to even know whether we have shale resources or not, thanks to tremendous pressure from our close friends, the Russians.
Yeah. Well, I do, and thank you very much for inviting me. My first time in Sofia, and so far I've been well fed. I look forward to sightseeing later this week, and thanks again for the invite. I want to talk about the U.S. shale production, oil and gas, but before I get into that, I want to touch on the event that's happening on November 8th this year. Two very interesting characters running for president in the United States. The way I like to describe it is that the only Republican in America that Hillary Clinton could beat is Donald Trump, and the only Democrat in America that Donald Trump can beat is Hillary Clinton. That's what we've got in our election this year. Look, the polls are tightening. This is what's called the Real Clear Politics average. It takes an aggregate of some nationwide polling, and it has done so over the months. And you see there have been ups and downs, but as of last Friday, Hillary Clinton had a very, very short lead. It was somewhere in the, somewhere in the neighborhood of 1.5%. As of Monday, the politics average dropped to 0.9%. If you look at the LA Times survey, it's another running survey, Trump is ahead of Hillary Clinton. And in addition, and Alex and I touched on this, Trump has actually picked up support amongst African-American voters and Hispanic voters over the last several weeks, which are key, of course, to the Democratic victories in the past, including those of Obama. These polls are going to change again, I'm sure. We're going to have a big debate next Monday, which could be pretty important in terms of shaping opinion. If people are accusing Hillary of having health problems, if she passes out or something, that could have a pretty big effect on the race. The expectations for Donald Trump are low. So if he, meets or exceeds them, it could produce a bounce as well. But the general election is not about popular support. Al Gore won the popular election in 2000 and lost because the real battle is in the states, in the Electoral College. And this is also from Real Clear Politics. The electoral map heavily favors the Democrats. I have stated that Republicans need to run a perfect candidate and draw, we talked about poker earlier and cards, they need to draw an inside straight generally. Donald Trump is far from a perfect candidate, as you have noticed. But the interesting phenomenon here is we're talking about instability in the regions, instability around the world. The Republicans and Democrats are in the midst of what I would call some instability as well. And it's having interesting effects on the map. Traditionally, the battleground states in the United States are Florida, Ohio, Colorado, Nevada. Those states are currently, as you can see by the gray, are toss-ups, they call them right now. But the interesting phenomenon here is that Hillary has actually created a toss-up in traditional Republican strongholds, like in the state of Georgia and also Arizona. And Donald Trump is gaining ground, in fact, toss-up states that are usually strong Democratic states in Minnesota, for example, Michigan, Iowa, Pennsylvania, New Hampshire. And so the result is that generally speaking, the Democrat, in this case Hillary Clinton, will have an advantage in the Electoral College. But as you see right now, it's far from a lock. So I predict that this race will come down to the wire unless something very strange happens. There are a lot of other factors at play. The polling is not reliable these days. If you look at Brexit, for example, everyone predicted that they would not vote to exit the EU, and they did. These candidates have universal name identification, which means that advertising has little to no impact on influencing how people think about them. Universally as well, they're mostly disliked. Opinions have been formed about these folks. The question of who will win the race will likely come down to who turns out their voters and which sets of voters are more enthusiastic. And as of right now, if you took a snapshot, you would say that the Trump supporters are much more enthusiastic. So anybody's guess. Thought I'd bring you a brief update on the election. I will get back to these candidates as it pertains to energy, but I'd like to get into the discussion about what we're seeing in the United States in terms of oil and gas production. Y'all, I can tell from the great presenter we just had and also the questions that you guys are very well versed in energy, so you don't, you have a sense of what's going on. I thought it would be interesting to give you sort of a historical perspective from the United States point of view, and I have a lot of charts, and I really like charts, so that's part of the reason. So this is a snapshot of the production of U.S. oil from 1960 to 2008. As you can see, in 1970, we peaked at about 9.6 million barrels a day. Around that time, Middle Eastern embargo, lots of talk about, lots of gas lines in the United States. They were talking about nationalizing the industry, price controls, and everything else. A lot of the reasons for the decline between 1970 and 2008 are political. They're also tied to this myth of peak oil. There was sort of a fanaticism out there that we were running out of this resource, so we had to do more with less, and we had to reduce our dependence. The other thing is, policies have had a lot to do with this, and I'll get into that as we go through. This is a quote from President Obama in 2012. You and I know that with only 2% of the world's oil reserves, we can't just drill our way to lower gas prices. That was in 2012, two or 3 years into the shale increases in production. This was the sort of prevailing political sentiment that we don't have any oil in our country, we don't have any resources in our country. Certainly not the case. As you can see from this chart, we have drilled our way to lower gas prices, literally. In 2012, when President Obama made that statement, WTI crude was priced at about 100 barrels a day, $100 a barrel, sorry. WTI crude in 2014, 93. In 2015, 48. Today, 44 is about what the WTI price is. So we have, in essence, done exactly what our politicians have said we could not do. We've drilled our way out to lower gas prices, and this is where it's from. This chart is production in thousands of barrels a day. Since 2008, the United States has seen a 88% increase in production. We've nearly doubled our production since 1970, and that is predominantly due to the shale plays that are in the United States. Now, during this whole time, Saudi Arabia has not reduced their production. They've kept the tills running. Their production levels have been relatively flat. OPEC made a decision in several meetings to try to bury the U.S. shale producers by keeping their market share, by keeping production going. The result has been that they've bent our producers, our shale producers, but they haven't broken them. In fact, the ironic thing that this has done in a lot of ways is forced these producers to be more economical. It's forced them to lower their production costs. And so now you're hearing stories that there are certain shale plays in the United States that are profitable at $40, $44 a barrel. And this is good, because this is where we expect, and a lot of the experts say, that the price should be for a very long time. So the unintended consequence of OPEC trying to break the shale producers was they've actually made them stronger in a lot of ways. Oh, sorry, I'm sorry, I didn't mean that. So that was the chart I was telling you about Saudi. Now here's the next chart, which is the incremental increase in oil production around the world. The green line is the United States and Canada. The orange line is the rest of the world. So basically, fully 97% of the increase in the world's oil production from 2008 through 2014 came from two countries, the United States and Canada. So between those 2 years, between those two dates, global oil production increased by 6.7 million barrels a day. 6.5 of that came from the United States and Canada. It's a big deal. It really does send a strong message, and it does do, I think the most important thing that this does is reflected in this chart. If you look at the red line is the unplanned global supply disruptions, okay? These are the events, the political events that happen in the Middle East, the instability, ISIS, things of that nature. The two blue lines that follow each other are the increase or the production of U.S. crude, both in terms of crude and liquid fuels. If you notice, it's like Starbucks coffee, right? I mean, they've basically flattened the price. There aren't these price shocks that you see anymore in global oil markets. This is massive because in the old days, and not so good old days, a small unstable event would cause price spikes. That global supply would shrink to nothing. Futures, everything else were affected by that. We have witnessed massive amounts of instability, as we've talked about. We've seen ISIS, threatening Europe and America and everywhere else, and yet not a touch, hasn't touched the global oil prices whatsoever. So to me, I think this is one of the best things that have come out of the shale revolution, is that the United States, a free nation, is producing a lot more oil and making the world more stable as a result. So there's plenty of oil in the United States. There's plenty of shale in the United States. This is a map of the U.S. shale plays. A couple of things, a couple of specifics. We talked earlier this week about the recent find in the Permian Basin. The Permian Basin is down here. That area has been picked at. People have been producing oil. The first commercial well in the Permian Basin was in 1921. Okay, this past couple of weeks, Apache, one of the independent producers, has found a new structure in the Permian Basin. They anticipate that they think it holds 3 billion barrels of oil and 75 trillion cubic feet of gas. The Eagle Ford play down in Texas, another huge shale producing area. Half of the shale, the Eagle Ford Shale, is in Mexico. Not one drop of that oil has been produced yet. Mexico doesn't have their act together. If they did get their act together, and they're trying, they would be participating in this as well. Talking about the Permian, this is a cross-section of the producers who are producing in the Permian Basin. All those dots represent different independent companies. Okay, the Apache play that I mentioned to you is in the lower corner in what's called Reeves County. That's the new find, and so that area will be dotted again with a bunch of spots. I wanted to show this slide because I think this is another unique aspect of the U.S. shale revolution is that there's hyper competition in the energy markets. You hear a lot about the Shells and the BPs and the Exxon Mobils and the big dogs. Our producers in the United States are largely independent. There's a lot of competition. There's buying and selling of assets. This is a huge component of why we've done so well in such a short period of time. We have a vibrant private enterprise in the United States, and these companies are competing. So they're competing to outproduce each other, to come up with the best technologies. They're winning that race by competing against each other, and then that's something that's really important. No state-owned oil company in the United States. So we're not unique in the world. There's a lot of shale out there, as you mentioned. I think what makes the United States unique, however, is that a lot of the shale plays in America, they're located in more rural areas. So the interface with population centers is minimized. And that's where you get a lot of the issues with, complaints about it and things like that. So not only are we blessed with these resources, but they're also happen to be located on private lands, and I'll get into that in a minute, and state lands, and they're just in sparse populated areas. And so we've been able to do a lot in a very short period of time as a result. Excuse me. And that's what I want to get to. This, I think, is sort of the glue or sort of how the puzzle got put together. It's technology, obviously. When you combine hydraulic fracturing with horizontal drilling, that was the big one. But the subsurface imaging has improved dramatically as well. We can find this stuff easier. We can pinpoint it a lot easier. We can reduce costs that way. Again, I mentioned the private enterprise and the competition, another huge factor. Mostly rural areas. The most important part, though, and I think this is the part that goes underlooked a lot, is the way that we treat private property in the United States. So, in the United States, we own the subsurface. Private property owners also own their subsurface. And as a result, they're in the game. They're incentivized to participate by receiving a piece of the pie. This has made the inconveniences of oil and gas production a lot less inconvenient. For example, in Ohio and Pennsylvania, in North Dakota, there are counties and cities in those states where they've gone from literally poverty level, low income, middle income families to millionaires practically overnight, in part because, and mostly because they have a piece of the pie. They're incentivized to allow this to happen because they get a piece of the action. And that's something that I think in terms of reform is really important to remember. Now, this isn't happening everywhere. This is happening, as I mentioned, in the shale plays in the private and state lands. This is a map of federal ownership. The United States is the landowner of 30% of America if you include the offshore areas 3 miles offshore. There's a very different picture being painted in these areas, which are also oil rich and gas rich. In a lot of cases, as you mentioned in Bulgaria, they're not even allowed to look. If you are not permitted to lease in an offshore area or an onshore area, you're not even allowed to really, companies aren't even free to do an inventory of the resources that are available. And so, as you see, the estimates in the outer continental shelf of Alaska, for example, haven't moved at all. We still think we have the same amount of oil in there than we had in 1996. But if you look at an area where they are exploring and drilling for oil and gas in the Gulf, in this case the Gulf of Mexico, look at the revisions of the reserve estimates that we have. 15 years, it's increased 6-fold. So we know we've got it. And every time we revise our estimates, we revise them upward. But we have to be permitted to look. And that's an important reform that needs to happen in the United States as well. And then if you look at the private lands and the state lands, different set of incentives. You look at how much oil they've been finding. This is the Marcellus Shale in the Ohio region. They first assessed, this is natural gas, they first assessed in 2002 that it had 2 trillion cubic feet of natural gas. In 2015, the estimate was 84 trillion cubic feet of natural gas. So here's the bottom line. We have, in my opinion, in the United States and in the world, an inexhaustible supply of oil and gas. We're not running out of this stuff. The peak oil people, the websites closed down. This is just not happening. What we don't have is the right policies in place in a lot of places. We don't have the right, structure of property rights. We don't have certain things, but one thing we do not have is a lack of the resource. So this is sort of why I brought those slides out, just to show you that the United States is not just, clicking along nicely. The potential is untapped. This is the disparity between production on on private and state lands versus federal lands. The orange line is the, I keep switching 2 of these. So you're looking at the increases on private lands and state lands versus practically a flat line on federal lands. So we have much more work to do. We have to sort of reform the way the federal lands work, and that's a function in a lot of ways of state policies and the state and the bureaucracies versus the efficiencies of private markets. So this is more important to you guys, natural gas, obviously, for a lot of reasons. The story is exactly the same. These are the comparative prices of LNG and oil and globally. LNG spot prices in Singapore in late 2014 were about $14 per million BTU. Today it's about $4.75 million per million BTU. So we've dramatically reduced the cost of LNG. They've plummeted. This, again, similar story, was the flat line of production of natural gas in the United States until 2008. I have a great story. A friend of mine started in the early 2000s what he called the Center for Liquefied Natural Gas. And the primary mission of that center was to promote the import of LNG into the United States. Several years later, he changed the primary mission to promote the export of LNG from the United States. So I think he's pretty entrepreneurial. Kept the center going, obviously. And this is why. This is the exact reason. We've seen a 28% increase in natural gas from 2008 to 2015. And we are swimming in natural gas in the United States. And the effect is very positive around the world. These were the landed LNG estimate, the landed LNG prices in 2013. Just 3 years ago, $14 per average in a lot of places, Japan, China, Korea. Today we're looking at about, those prices are about a third of what they were. And I think the future's bright. There are other countries who are investing heavily in LNG, including Australia. As you can see here, they have nearly $200 billion invested in their LNG export. So this could be an additional boon to this region as well, hopefully. So what does this all mean from my perspective? I don't envision us, unless some very, very strange and bad things happen, I don't envision a world where we're going to see high oil and gas prices for a while. I envision a world where OPEC continues to lose their ability to dictate prices. I envision a world where Russia has less opportunities to use energy as a weapon. Of course, you guys know about this much more than me, and there's a lot more to it than that, but the foundation is there. But this is not without work. This is not without its opponents and its detractors. There are a lot of organizations out there that don't like what's going on. They preferred the politics of scarcity. It was a much better argument for them. And now they have resorted to demonizing the fracturing process. They've resorted to demonizing these resources as dangerous and dirty. A lot of misinformation out there being propagated by very well-funded organizations. Politics matter. The result of the election, which I'll talk about again in a minute, are going to make a difference. Global agreements could potentially make a difference. President Obama was just at the UN yesterday trying to put his foot on the gas to get enough people to sign the Paris Agreement. These guys are big and they mean business. We have over 550 environmental groups in the United States with a combined annual revenue of $3.5 billion. 28 of these groups have budgets of over $20 million. Increasingly, they're all focused on undermining the production of fossil fuel. That's their big prize. So this isn't something that is just happening easily. There's a lot of resistance to it. People are protesting pipeline permits and things like that. You may have heard of the Keystone Pipeline, for example. And that's why policy really does matter. And with respect to energy issues, the differences between these two candidates are stark. Hillary Clinton has basically stated that, she would like to continue the Obama track, meaning more increases in reducing carbon, more EPA regulations, more international agreements. She wants to, quote unquote, put an end to fracking on federal lands. She said that Obama's policies were just a good start, basically. That's kind of where she sort of is positioning herself with respect to this. And then you have Trump, who is a relative unknown politically. He comes from a very different background. He has been saying the right things. I know this because he's been citing some of our studies. He wants to continue. He understands the economic benefits of this, but he's a big question mark. We have no idea what he's going to do when he gets into office. We don't know what he's going to do tomorrow. I mean, every day you wake up and it's like a fun new day. Like what's Donald Trump going to do today? He's a phenomenon. But we do know what he says he wants to do, and I do know from firsthand experience that he is surrounding himself with people who understand these issues and who understand the impact of regulation on business. And I've been advising informally to some extent as well, so I feel comfortable in that unless I'm just wrong about everything. But there are question marks. What is his relationship with Russia? It's sort of a big thing. When he says something about NATO and being not relying on NATO, does he mean that, or is he just kind of off the hook? So lots of question marks about him. But in terms of the energy policies, he's made it clear that he wants to continue to allow the shale revolution to flourish. So in closing. U.S. shale revolution has occurred in spite of, not because of, policy. I think that's an important thing to remember. It's a testament to entrepreneurship, free markets, and most importantly, private property rights. We've got that system in our country, and it has worked especially well and will do so for the foreseeable future. That's it. Thank you.
Very positive news, which are not generally known in Europe generally. In Bulgaria, of course, property rights right now do not allow you to take a piece of the pie, as you said, and there are some of us who think that property rights should be changed here to allow that. And it would be a huge boost to a number of things. Questions, please. Anybody? If not, maybe I should. Maybe I should start. The most interesting chart is the one that shows you that most of what you described as great progress happen on private land, and that the federal land, which, as you mentioned, the U.S. owns about a third of all the land, especially in the West. Yeah, plus the offshore. Do you think Hillary would actually try to continue this policy, which has been, proven really very ineffective? And if so, doesn't that mean that there's an opening there for her opponents, political opponents, to advertise the reality of it, which is just amazing? I mean, if you look at the price Americans pay for gas right now, and you compare it to what this poorest country in the European Union pays, it's just astounding. It's astounding. We pay in the United States like 3 times less for gasoline than people here with an income that's a fraction of that in the United States. So what do you think the effect of that may be on the election?
Well, a lot of that price is, I don't know what your tax structure is on gasoline here, but we have very low taxes, relatively speaking, on gasoline, which is a big help. Yeah, Hillary Clinton has basically said she wants to continue the policies that this current administration has put on federal lands, which is a problem, because basically it takes 5 days to permit a well in Texas. It takes on the average of over a year to permit a well on federal land. It's that constant sort of bureaucratic, the slow walking of the process that makes it very difficult to produce on federal lands. And so it's caused a disparity amongst states that happen to be cursed with federal land ownership as well. So states that are flourishing are states that have private lands in their areas are producing the oil. I am frustrated that these issues have not cropped up in the general election, in the discussion. I was hoping that there would be a larger focus on it, but there isn't. And I think it's a very, very bright line between the two candidates in an otherwise sort of blurry kind of world. But I think that the uniqueness of this election, and I've been following electoral politics, have been campaigns, policy for 20 plus years, nothing has been like this election cycle. And so while I'm disappointed, I'm not surprised because of this election is basically a character election. The policies matter little. Hillary Clinton is running a campaign to say that her opponent is not stable and cannot be trusted to have the button, if you will. And Trump's favorite moniker for her is Crooked Hillary. So it's a personality contest, and the winner will be the one who doesn't drive the other one into complete oblivion at this point.
Yeah. Other questions? Elian?
Well, my question is, okay, energy does not take doesn't have a high profile in this election, but how has energy affected U.S. foreign policy? Because you see in the Middle East as a whole, I mean, it probably is something that Anders also touched upon, but it has a tremendous effect on foreign policy and generally on global affairs, because nobody expects anymore the U.S. to have this zeal to intervene in the Middle East just to secure. And in that context, it's very strange, because on one side, everybody expects and actually accuses America of being the global policeman. Yet when America just chooses not to intervene, then there's a chaos created. And China, for example, is very concerned because its main supply lines comes from the Middle East, yet it is absolutely unstable in South Yemen now or in other places. So how energy and foreign policy, I don't know whether it's the... Yeah.
Well, this administration has been more focused on, in terms of energy, at least domestically, upon reducing the production of coal, natural gas, oil. And I can't speak for the administration, but the stability in the price of oil, the reduction of LNG, that's happened because of the market. The reduction in pollution, the carbon dioxide pollution, has happened in large part because of the markets. I don't know to what extent the thinkers at DOD and state and others have looked at this as a geopolitical strategic weapon, the export of our oil and gas resources. They should, because I would much rather see us be a major player than countries with dictators who use oil to profit and you know, stabilize their regime and feed the people and all that. Look what's happening in Venezuela. Look what's happening, you know, as we described in the situation in Russia. A lot of that has to do with the fact that the price of oil is no longer helping fuel those nations. So I would hope that those things are being considered. You are right. The United States appetite amongst the people for intervening in the Middle East is not there anymore. The war in Iraq completely lifted the air out of that balloon, and the current situation where we don't need them as much as we did for our energy only exacerbates that. So I'm not sure I answered your question, but.
Do you venture a guess, Tom, about the spread of the shale revolution outside of the United States? We know that in Europe, in Poland, so far, they hasn't proven very successful, but the British are now starting to frack. The Chinese have already had some successes. We know that Argentina has tremendous shale resources.
Israel too.
Israel too, yes. What do you think about the potential for this revolution spreading elsewhere?
Well, again, I think we've got the perfect recipe in the United States, and I hope that our energy producers be ambassadors and export the technology and work with other regions. I think companies who do this for a living should take you know, a serious effort in allowing other in providing opportunities for other countries to participate, because it's a game changer. I think that again, I think the property rights issue is important. Even in England, the Crown owns the subsurface rights, and so if we're going to take a serious look at you know, stakeholders, private citizens, we should really look at the property rights angle. The other thing is, again, we're blessed with these resources, and a lot of the areas that they're located, people don't live. Population centers are much more dense in the areas you're talking about, in the shale plays in these areas, and so it's that much more of a challenge, because, you know, in the old days, people loved oil, and it was kind of cool, and even in Los Angeles, if you drive from LAX, you still see a few of those pump jacks going, right? That's not today. The reality today is that people don't want to see how the world, they don't want the stuff that makes the world work sitting in their backyards. So that's a very tremendous obstacle, I think, to getting this going in other places.
Other questions? Yes, ma'am.
You told that oil production increased with 88% after 2008. And the main share of this increasing in supply comes from United States and Canada. In the same time, gas production increased too for this period. My question about another side of market. The demand is more domestic or for the export of this oil production and gas production?
Yeah, we just lifted our ban a year and a half ago. We were probably the only nation in the world who had a complete export ban on their oil products. This again was sort of Arab embargo politics, and it took till 2015 to lift the ban. And so that is beginning now. We have a glut of oil in the Bakken region, for example, that needs to move out shipments are beginning, but again, it's a market, and the prices are low. Natural gas, LNG, we've done more of that. Again, my entrepreneurial friend who switched the mission of his center, and we have had projects approved, but that even has to continue to improve. It's a very cumbersome sort of two-step bureaucratic process for getting LNG sites in the United States approved. I think there's room to improve there. I think that more shifting of coal, electricity to natural gas in the United States, both by market forces and by regulation, will lift that price a little bit and be more of an incentive for companies to export. So I think it's coming. I think that prices, if I could predict markets, I wouldn't be sitting here. I'd be running around in a yacht or something. But I do think that the important thing to know is we've got the infrastructure. We're beginning to build that, the ability to move this gas around the world, and I think that just has to help everybody.
Other questions?
May I ask about the campaign something? Because we saw great resistance, hidden or open, between Donald Trump as a candidate of the Republican Party and so-called Republican aristocracy, especially Ted Cruz and Paul Ryan, my friend Paul Ryan. I know him from my challenge. But I would like to ask, is this problem and conflict is some kind of it's hidden conflict between the different producing and energy companies who are sitting around them, or something different?
Yeah, two-parter, I think, or at least I'm going to answer it in two ways. The first is that it's no secret that the Republicans are in a conversation amongst themselves about the future of the party. The same can be said for the Democrats. If you look at the Democratic primary, you had a ultra sort of self-identified socialist who almost won. Donald Trump had a field of 17 other people, of which 15 easily could have been just as, like I said, could have easily beaten Hillary Clinton. But he won. And the reason that he won is because of that phenomenon where there's a whole class of people in the United States who feel like their politicians across the board have not delivered, have not looked out for them, have not done deals, have fought amongst themselves. This conversation will continue. I don't know if Donald Trump was the catalyst or the beneficiary of that. But again, nothing in this election cycle is normal. And so I think we're going to see a shifting, we talked about shifting alliances in the Balkans and everything. There's a shifting electorate right now. And where that ends is going to be a great question. Oil and gas companies and kind of where they are, the establishment, the PAC money, all that stuff, they're largely either sitting on the sidelines or strategically supporting both. That's the other unique thing about this cycle is nobody wants to be associated with Donald Trump, but most of those people are going to probably vote for the guy. So a lot of the industry is sitting out the election from the perspective of dollars, but he has surrounded himself with oil men who are advising him, and that will thaw. Washington has a really funny way of sort of settling in. Once this whole thing shakes out, everyone will assess where they need to be and position themselves to, oh, I was with him all along, right? I mean, there'll be a lot of that afterwards if he ends up winning. If he doesn't, there'll be a lot of, I told you so, this guy's a nightmare, you know, that kind of thing. So it's an interesting time in electoral politics in the United States, for sure.
Other questions? Ilya?
One thing is a first in as well in American election. It's the role of Russia, this hacking and et cetera, but it's much more than this. I mean, it's for the first time any other country has sort of entered into the secret rooms of, it's the holy grail of American election process. How much that is a real issue, or it's a perceived threat which is being played just on a...
That's a good question. I don't know how much of it is real versus perceived. I do know, when we talked about this, that some of his advisors who are no longer on the payroll, although there are reports that he's not even paying anybody, but that's another story, are no longer part of the campaign. I'm speaking about a guy named Paul Manafort, for example. You know, Donald Trump's a businessman from New York, right? He's not a politician, so he's got interests, you know, commercial interests. I don't know how that spills into foreign policy. I don't know how that spills into how he deals with Russia and this area. I don't think it has a big effect on energy generally. I don't think that he will, you know, be successful in sort of stifling. You know, I don't think they're mixed together. But I do think that he says a lot of things, and then his team sort of corrects them, and he goes on a course correction, because his whole life he's been just speaking off the cuff to earn media. He's the king of earned media. There are estimates that he's generated somewhere in the neighborhood of the equivalent of $1.5 billion worth of advertising in terms of the free media, the earned media that he's generated. So this is where he comes from. But if you noticed too, at the point where he dumped some of his advisors, including Manafort, and brought in professionals, his poll numbers have improved. He's been more disciplined. He's stayed on message. He's on the teleprompter more. So I suspect that if he ekes out an election victory, that it's not going to be as problematic as it is perceived to be.
Last question, then we have to have a little break, I believe. Anybody? If not, we are going into a break. Thank you very much. Thank you, Tom.
Thank you.
There is coffee, tea, and other things in the back of the room, I'm told.